Of the characters in the game, the Protector is probably the one that has changed the least. That concept of guys in diving suits being these big, tough Protector type guys has pretty much stayed with us the whole time.
He was the one thing that stayed, that was persistent through the whole development process. Once we really started and sat down and started doing concepts, he was what he would look like entirely changed over a period of a few months. The very first drawing I did was a guy in a dive suit, and we knew we wanted those guys in. But the actual details of what that would be for the Big Daddies did change, but we always knew we wanted a guy in a dive suit.
We originally had 4 Protectors, and we had to, we made one cut, and then we made another cut, and we're down to 2. And we had put in a lot of work to one of the Protectors that, in the end, we realized that if we wanted to have the polish time for the 2 main Protectors, that we would have to cut this one that we called the Slow Pro. The Slow Pro,
it's the heavy artillery.
Yeah, he's basically the tank. The Slow Pro was his full name. Again, we have the dumbest names, I apologize, but Slow Pro is Slow Protector effed up melee.
Nice.
Yeah, it's for the kids,
If Nate was in here right now, he'd be crying. It's his favorite concept.
One of them got cut, which I'm not happy about.
Yeah, he was cool.
That was maybe my favorite one.
Yeah.
It's still not clear to me why I got cut. Probably just to hurt me.
Originally, we had the whole ecology system, and the gatherers were actually not girls. They were these slugs, these little slugs that flew around, and if you got near them, they'd roll up and start clicking, and that's when the Protector would come in and attack you. And we had the full animation for those guys were working fine, and you step back and it's like we want to build this relationship between the Protectors and the gatherers, and nobody cares about a slug.
It wasn't really much of a choice to whether or not you wanted to harvest them or not. It was just like, that's an ugly sea slug, I want to kill that little...
Yeah, it was like, you just wanted to stomp on them. Yeah. They were really nasty, and they just looked like things you squished. But it took us like a long time to find a gatherer that we liked. Yeah. Like we went through, we started getting concepts from everyone internally was working on it, and we even had outsourcing concept artists like throwing their ideas into the mix.
You got to dig some of those up. Remember the little squirrely
Yeah,
guy?
There was one that was like this little like gerbil man.
There were crabs. There were going with the whole underwater theme.
There was a consideration they might be monkeys at one point, which that idea didn't last long.
I'll admit it, my bad idea was a dog whose front legs could move, but its back legs were bound in a wheelchair, going around eating stuff. Yeah, that's a bad idea.
There was like this little hunchback Oompa Loompa type of guy, and eventually we started seeing that the more humanoid we got, the better it felt.
Ultimately, it came down to just you don't have sympathy for any of those characters, or you don't want to interact with them.
And then Rob Waters, our in-house concept guy who worked on all of our stuff in recent years, drew this incredibly creepy looking little girl, and that was like, this is the way we've got to go. It's incredibly creepy, and it can be expressive. And one of the biggest problems with the slug back in the time was he had no appendages, he had no face, he had no eyes, like you
had no lower jaw even.
Yeah, you had no idea what this thing was trying to communicate to you as a gamer.
Having her evolve from an insect into, another tentacle monster, all the way to this idea that it's these little girls. I think it was just exciting because you're crossing a line there I don't think people expect, and having Ken come up with ideas like that, and these challenging ideas you have to illustrate and sell to an audience, and make it edgy without going over the line. I think that was just rewarding, challenging. Hopefully we've done a good job with that.
Specifically, the splicer characters changed a lot over time, and they came from a lot of different places. It was before I think the story had really gelled, and before the architecture had gelled, and interestingly enough, those have a lot of effect on what the characters are going to look like, because they really have to sit down in that world and live in that world. And we talked before how we changed the aesthetic of the facility from much more industrial, practical sort of place to a much more residential place. And I think that when we saw that happening in the architecture, then we realized we had to go back and look at these splicers again, and they had to be as sort of domestic looking as that world. So they, some of the original passes, you'll see monsters that, are very monstrous. And that was one angle that we were thinking about, their genetic distortions and how maybe they even specifically mutated themselves to be able to use certain weapons better, or like things like arms would go away because they didn't need that arm. They had such a specific duty that they'd created for themselves. And then again, as we moved away from that, we basically went back to square one, and then Rob took over. And we came up with pretty much the splicers you see now. A lot of the distortions in the faces came from, actually Ken had found this thing online, and it was called Project Facade, which was, it's terrifying. It basically was some of the early attempts at sort of plastic and reconstructive surgery to treat soldiers at the end of World War I. Who suffered horrible injuries to their face, and it was these sort of creative solutions to reconstruct their faces. And of course, the medicine wasn't really there, so sometimes the product was as terrifying as where they started out. But those were kind of a disturbing inspiration for some of the faces some of the ways that you see the splicers' faces are distorted. Came from looking at those pictures.
Yeah.
Cringing at those pictures.
Yeah. The other reference was looking at old mugshots from the 1940s. For whatever reason, just times were harder or whatever, and you could just really see it in their faces, and just some of those portraits were just sort of inspiration for, a really sort of different looking character.
And hairstyles,
Yeah.
some really bizarre hairstyles.
Yeah.
For criminals then.